You best start believing in psyops, cause you're living in one.
New details have emerged about the Chinese spy balloon investigation.
But people in this crowd were saying and believing 7,000 have been killed.
Let's see, whatever, yeah. If you're watching this, you already know how an iceberg chart works, so let's get started. Booby trapping is the rigging of seemingly harmless objects for the express purpose of maiming or killing an enemy. This is often used as a psychological tactic against enemy forces and patrols, who would then be laden with an additional threat to their welfare while being in a combat zone. This tactic has been used throughout history, but the most notable more recent examples were seen during the Vietnam War, where many US jungle patrols were subjected to rigged explosives inside of cans and other objects, as well as concealed pits filled with sharpened punji stakes or even venomous snakes. It's an effective measure in depleting morale and slowing the travel speed of any would-be enemy ground force. Disinformation campaigns are the self-explanatory tactic of a collective effort made to misconstrue a narrative at an opposition's expense. This is something widely seen in politics, where often the negative belief perpetuated about a subject is more important than the truth, especially if it's catchy enough to stick. This is different from misinformation, as disinformation forgoes the benefit of the doubt associated with an incorrect narrative. I honestly don't blame you if you mix them up. They're honestly interchangeable, so who cares? Let's move on to the next one. A charge, or bonsai attack, is an ancient offensive maneuver in warfare that attempts to overwhelm an enemy by forcing a close quarters engagement. It was mostly done on foot by sprinting at the enemy, but also done by cavalry on horseback in many instances. World War I mostly phased out this maneuver in conventional warfare, due to the widespread usage of heavy machine guns and fortified trenches in battle. But World War II saw its resurgence by the Japanese Imperial Army, who often paired these attacks with surprise ambushes in a manner labeled bonsai. These were often thwarted by Allied forces simply due to the tactic's obsolescence in modern combat, but was still an effective measure in leaving GIs shook well after the war. A siege is a military blockade of a city or fortification with the intent of conquering by attrition. Deriving from the Latin word meaning to sit, this is often done by surrounding a given area and choking it out of resources or free travel, all to the citizens' torment. One of the most famous known instances was the mythological account of the Trojan War, which ultimately concluded with the Greeks deceiving the Trojans with an effigy of a horse filled with soldiers, finally conquering the city after a 10-year siege. Planting, or fabrication, is the falsification of intel intended to be retrieved by an opposing force. This is often used to misdirect and deceive regarding information involving top-secret implications. This was a common practice during World War II and the Cold War, with every side experimenting with relaying false coordinates, telegrams, and even false invasion plan files in specific cases. It was ultimately summited towards the end of World War II, however, with a clever operation you'll learn about further down this list. A cover-up is the act, mostly committed by government agencies, which seeks to hide evidence or witnesses to illegal events or activity committed by a greater power. This is often done through misdirection, manipulation, and intimidation in many cases, and many supposed victims often have their lives permanently altered as a result. Events surrounding major historical moments in history are often accused of this, and sometimes for good reason. Since the true narrative is something seldom discovered, critical thinking and research with a strong predictive intuition is something invaluable to anyone seeking the truth in all forms. A red herring is arguably the most widely used tactic by those who seek to psychologically manipulate. Being the subtle art of misdirection, governments and media outlets have used this tactic for millennia in order to turn the public's attention towards events much less damning. With social media as prevalent as it is, it's almost never been easier to sway public opinion on a scale this wide. And since most people actually interpret events at face value, unless misdirected not to do so, staying ahead of the curve of those who seek to use red herrings on a massive scale becomes almost impossible. Espionage is the practice of spying or using spies in order to retrieve intel from an opposing force. This was a practice most well seen throughout the Cold War, as forces on every side wanted to optimize the most covert methods possible in order to retrieve key intel. But this has been a practice done since wars began. Achieving the unfair advantage is what's key to victory to any serious force. However, the truest espionage are the operations we haven't caught, that could still be influencing us to this day by actors we can't identify. But the best we can do is just hope that's all hypothetical, right? This tier covered some of the primary concepts that lay the foundations for the entries ahead. But don't mistake them for concepts understood at face value. Use your own critical thinking and discretion when approaching ahead. No man is truly immune to intentive propaganda or psyops, so viewer discretion is advised. E-girl army recruiting was the phenomenon that took place around 2022 on TikTok, which saw various attractive female military influencers gain huge traction on the site. One notable example going by the handle Hey Lujan would often post thirst traps inside of helicopters and many selfies beside army-issued equipment, simply certified Fed activities. This wasn't just a domestic case either. Natalia Fadiv, better known as Gun Waifu, is an Israeli influencer and IDF soldier who posted in a very similar style. Due to the sudden rise of these influencers, it's been suspected that more covert intentions are planned by the respective agencies in charge, leading to the fairly obvious speculation that this is an effort by the Army's Psyop division in order to combat the staggeringly low recruitment numbers over the past few years. But you be the judge. Cat warfare is the specific instance in history where Egypt was defeated by an enemy force weaponizing their own sacred beliefs against them. The Battle of Pelusium in 525 BC pit the Egyptian army against the invading Persian forces led by Cambyses II. Due to his knowledge of Egyptian culture and religion, he had his soldiers paint the image of Bastet on their shields, the goddess most closely associated with cats. They also used multitudes of cats they collected along the journey as hostages and released on the battlefield itself, causing mass chaos and disorder in their opponent's land, not wanting to molest the images of their sacred deity. This led to a significant decisive victory for Persia, and went down in history as one of the first uses of religious strategy and warfare as a weapon. Shock and awe is a military strategy based on the usage of overwhelming power and spectacular displays of force to destroy an enemy's will to fight. This was most well known in the public consciousness during the Second Gulf War, otherwise known as the invasion of Iraq in 2003, where US forces began continuous bombing and decapitation strikes from the jump on the invasion, leveling the capital of Baghdad with non-stop strikes for days on end. Coalition ground forces were then given a head start offensive towards the city on the last day of the bombing, and declaring the capital to be secured by US forces within a few weeks, as they thought. This strategy was effective in its pursuits in psychological strategy. However, it didn't aid in the ongoing insurgency efforts that would take place in the country over the next decade. Baghdad Bob, or by his real name, Mohammed Saeed al-Sahaf, was an Iraqi diplomat and politician. By the time of the Iraq War in 2003, he was promoted to the Minister of Information by Saddam Hussein. He was most well known for his daily press briefings during the onset of the war, often making unproven, exaggerated claims about body count and troop morale of the invading force. His name came from a long history of alliterative nicknames given to propaganda outlet hosts throughout wars the US has been in, with some examples being Hanoi Hannah during Vietnam and Seoul City Sioux during Korea. In one ironic occasion, he claimed that no US tanks were anywhere near the limits of Baghdad, when in fact there were fleets of tanks and ground forces advancing only a few hundred meters from the press's location. He was subsequently removed from his position after coalition forces secured Baghdad in early April, becoming one of the most well-known examples of a reversal outcome of propaganda efforts in recent history. Color propaganda is the classification tiers given the different characteristics of propaganda depending on its source and intent. White propaganda, in usage, doesn't hide its origin or nature, and reveals its intent just by existing. Black propaganda is quite the opposite, by using disinformation measures in order to conceal its source or fabricate claims to achieve a specific narrative goal. Gray propaganda is somewhere in the middle, often using an honest source but not being transparent about how it connects to a sought narrative. The latter color is often the most prevalent type we're witness to, as the plausible deniability it crowns itself with, and the boldness it gives to loyal so-called free thinkers source fiends, is often too powerful to ignore. The Art of War is an ancient Chinese military guide written by the famed military strategist Sun Tzu in roughly the 5th century BC. All of its 13 chapters are devoted to different skills and tactics related to warfare and its application among leaders of militaries, stressing the importance of intel and espionage within the scope of warfare. It was well ahead of its time in terms of lasting strategies. It was translated into French in the 1700s and completely translated into English by 1910, and soon became well favored by Generals Douglas MacArthur and Norman Schwarzkopf Jr., all citing inspiration from the book. All threads of modern psychological warfare can at least philosophically tie their inspirations and methods to this ancient text. Khan maneuvers were the military strategies of the Mongolian army. Led by Genghis Khan in the 13th century, they were used in order to strike fear in the hearts of villages and armies in their wake. One of the intended goals of Khan was to defeat the will of his opposition before even attacking, coercing them into reaching a settlement. They would use heralds to share accounts of massacres committed by the Mongol army against villages that didn't submit to their terms. This, however, wasn't just propaganda. They would actually commit those acts, and worse, against those who stood in their way. Joining or dying is an effective ultimatum against those with no recourse to defend themselves, especially against an innumerable nomadic horde of bloodthirsty killers with a reputation that precedes them. Heavy metal is the broad categorization of the genre known as metal, which shouldn't need much explanation. But the reason for its inclusion on this list is concerning its common usage in unorthodox interrogation, especially among the CIA. Specific examples including songs by Deicide, Metallica, and various black metal bands were used, as well as a specific song, March of the Pigs by 9 Inch Nails, being included, which is pretty bass too. The reason for its usage is simply the shock value it had during the global war on terror among those who have never listened to music like this before. In some cases, the music would be blasted on repeat against the subject for up to 48 hours, which was shown to be an effective measure in making most subjects spill everything they knew. As you might expect, many artists and bands were not so keen on their music being used for interrogation, but it is what it is. A fall guy, often labeled as a scapegoat, is the person where criticism or blame is directed upon in order to shield a larger operation at play. This is a common practice in politics, where covert actions done by administrations often use layers of proxy individuals for the purpose of plausible deniability. Conspiracies surrounding specific events and narratives throughout history are often subject to just as much intrigue. Lee Harvey Oswald, JFK's alleged assassin, was quoted as claiming that he was the patsy when questioned on his motive for the act in between interrogations, denying any responsibility for the act. It's a more common occurrence than we'd want to believe. The psychology of the mob really only seeks to shift the blame of wrongdoing onto one single tangible person. Too much complexity to a situation, as they always are, is something that doesn't sell headlines as easily. Project Eldest Son was a covert operation done in conjunction by MACV-SOG and the CIA to rig various NVA and Viet Cong ammunition caches with explosive rounds. This was often done by staging false ambushes against previously killed NVA and VC troops along typical supply routes, and planting crates of 7.62x39, 12.7x108 AA rounds, and Type 67 mortar shells with a single explosive round. The ammo recovered would then be mixed in with various other supply caches used, masking the rigged cartridge until it's eventually fired, which would often kill the shooter who loaded it. This was intended to sow distrust among the ranks of the enemy forces, and especially against their Chinese suppliers, even bolstering this by forging complaint documents intended to be sent to higher-ups, blaming the explosive malfunctions on faulty subpar Chinese manufacturing. This operation saw significant success, as many dead enemy combatants were found with the bolts of their Type 56 AKMs lodged inside of their skulls as the years went on, and proved to be one of the many psychological operations the US implemented throughout the conflict. Weather balloons are traditionally known as aerial devices. Carrying various measuring instruments, they're used for the purpose of relaying information about the atmosphere to a nearby research station. They also have a tendency to look strange when observed at a distance from the ground, leading to many bystanders believing them to be UFOs. The most famous example of this was the Roswell incident, when in 1947, the US Air Force tested a prototype of a modified weather balloon used to listen for Soviet atomic tests. When the outcome of one of these tests led to the device veering off course and crashing, it led to a nationwide hysteria claiming the existence of flying saucers and alien life within our skies, as well as a supposed cover-up by the US in the days following. In more recent history, in 2023, unexpected white balloons started appearing all over the continental US, claimed to be of Chinese origin, which were swiftly destroyed by the Air Force, leading to the speculation on whether they served a similar purpose or for something more sinister. Safe passage cards are notices distributed to enemy personnel that allow safe travel in occupied territory upon surrendering with the notice displayed. Chu Hoi was the initiative by the US in South Vietnam to encourage VC troops to defect from the guerrilla war effort. Messages with instructions of surrender in Vietnamese were often printed on clear plastic waterproof bags given the US soldiers to seal ammunition away from the elements, and when used, they would be littered all over the jungle as a constant reminder to enemy forces about that available option. According to the US, 101,511 PAVN and VC defected under the program. However, the sincerity of the ones surrendered has been left dubious to history. Supposed safe passage cards were often passed to US soldiers during World War II in Vietnam, often promising money and safety upon defection. But as POW history would prove, these were completely bogus, so nobody really fell for the scheme. Hearts and Minds refers to the strategies and programs used by the US and loyalist governments in order to win support from the civilian populations and to inversely discourage insurgency. During Vietnam, CORDS, standing for Civil Operations and Rural Development Support, was the initiative done by the US government in order to reinforce rural communities and militias against VC influence. This was an operation carried out on both ends of the war, first being dropped due to the more attractive strategy known as search and destroy, being favored by General Westmoreland as a flex of superior firepower with less potential for friendly casualties, and then re-implemented towards the end, which wasn't as effective due to insurgency threats minimizing by this time. During the Iraq War, similar measures were taken in order to curb the threats of insurgency and terrorism among the Iraqi people, with the Army's dedicated form Psyop Division carrying out such measures. Airborne leaflets are a propaganda measure used by military forces in order to break morale or facilitate direct communication with the populace. They were initially dropped off the sides of biplanes during World War I, but then revolutionized in World War II due to a modified bomb dropped from conventional aircraft for maximum disbursement. Some would contain images of graves filled with fallen comrades, or longing pleas from supposed loved ones for them to return, anything to make the war seem not worth fighting. In other cases, leaflets would be dropped over civilian populaces, outlining a list of cities that would be bombed, encouraging civilians to immediately evacuate the surrounding area. This was a common practice by Allied forces in the Pacific Theater. One of the most effective campaigns for leaflets was from the US during the First Gulf War, which flexed the sheer killing power the US possessed in terms of air superiority. This was believed to be instrumental in the surrender of 87,000 Iraqi troops from the conflict in 1991. 4GW, or Fourth Generation Warfare, is characterized by the blurring of distinction between war and politics, as well as enemies and civilians. It's often defined by conflicts that are complex and long-term, with decentralized forces using terrorism and guerrilla warfare, with the intended goal of morale attrition against an enemy force. The most well-known example was the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, who used many asymmetric methods against a force much more powerful than them in order to achieve a similar outcome, taking advantage of the US's non-linear goals for definitive victory. Al-Qaeda would use similar tactics, but updated to a new century, implementing direct telecommunications, cyber warfare, and the usage of suicide bombings against enemy forces. The foundational motives for each were quite different, however, as the motive for VC forces was the political goal of achieving communist ideals among the peasantry and urban populations, while the goals for Al-Qaeda were extremist religious ideals and warfare, better known as jihad. This distinction often defines the pathology behind collective groups initiating such measures. FPS MIC funding is the allegation that various actors within the military-industrial complex, as well as the US government itself, have meddled with first-person shooter games through direct influence, and even funding. It's been confirmed that developers and studios behind Doom and Call of Duty have been contracted by the US military in order to create training sim games for tank crews, and even infantry with their own dedicated multiplayer FPS. The coincidence between each installment's campaign plot relative to the events of conflict with US forces can't be ignored either, with the Iranian officer Qasem Soleimani mirroring the Iranian general Gorbrani while being assassinated in a similar fashion in the most recent Call of Duty installment, but it could just be chalked up to real-life inspiration. However, Freedom of Information Act requests showed that directives concerning the quote, US Army of the future are planned to be discussed with Activision Blizzard reps by Pentagon officials. Scenarios including a future war with China and the assassinations of individuals closely reminiscent of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. This has been speculated to be an effort to combat record-low recruitment numbers by the US military, and possibly even condition the domestic gaming community on the possibilities of such scenarios occurring in real life. A false flag is an act committed with the intent of disguising the actual source of responsibility and shifting the blame onto another party, typically an enemy. The motive of such has been intended for use of rallying public support towards a reaction, which often leads to a full-scale war. This leads to a controversial allegation about a government's ethical nature, especially the question being, would a first-world government, such as the US, murder its own people in order to achieve an ultimate catalyst for a greater goal? The answer to that is yes, but we'll get to that later on. But one of the most famous alleged examples of a false flag in history was the story of the Lusitania, a British civilian ocean liner that was sunk by a German U-boat in 1915 amidst the First World War, carrying 128 US citizens on board. It was confirmed that US newspapers refused to publish the warning from Germany that said that they would sink any suspected military-use ships flying the British flag. Also, future expeditions to the wreckage showed large stockpiles of munitions being transported on the vessel, which would be considered a war crime by modern standards. Various examples of actual false flag operations, as well as planned ones, will be included on this list. The definition just sets the precedent for what's to come, even on the lower depths. Algorithmic manipulation is a sympathetic cycle that works in two ways. Regarding media platforms, the manipulation of the algorithm itself is brought about by content that attracts views, which then therefore conditions and manipulates the user's taste for similar content. The supposed views the content attracts can be the weakest link in this cycle in terms of manipulation, with bot farms quickly becoming a trend among marketing agencies. As a gray hat source of promotion, you can never truly know what organically grows a following anymore. Everything from the front page of Spotify, YouTube, Reddit, or any media sharing platform can be vulnerable to astroturfing, which would obviously seek to favor political narratives or beliefs chosen by the companies to promote. Overall, it may seem obvious or even harmless now, but put in the wrong hands will give someone immeasurable power over the flow of information, if that's not the case already. Impaling is a method of torture or execution done by penetrating an individual with an object such as a stake, pole, spear, or hook, and often held upright. The most famous practitioner of this method was Vlad Tepes, or Vlad Dracula, meaning son of the dragon. But he was ruler of Wallachia, better known as Romania in modern terms, in the 15th century, and was known for his practice of impaling Ottoman Turk soldiers during their long-standing conflict, earning the name Vlad the Impaler within our modern consciousness. One case, in 1462, saw the impalement of up to 20,000 Turk POWs scattered along the Danube River, which caused such a horrific sight that the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmet II, turned his invading army back to Constantinople upon witnessing it. Impaling, much like crucifixion, was seen as more of a deterrent measure than just being a form of capital punishment, which warned everyone of the consequences that being an enemy of the state would bring. Okinawan civilians refers to the battle for Okinawa Island between the US and Imperial Japan in mid-1945, but specifically regarding the civilian population that inhabited it prior. The Japanese engaged in rampant psychological conditioning of the Okinawan people leading up to the ground invasion, claiming that the Marines invading the island were, quote, a special force recruited from jails and insane asylums for bloodlust, who would ravage the women and eat their babies alive if captured. Along with this, the civilians were often given hand grenades as a measure to end themselves, and hopefully take out a GI with them if discovered. This wasn't an effective strategy, however, as caves filled with civilians often erupted with grenade explosions from self-inflicted measures, simply at the distant sound of US armor and personnel passing by, none the wiser. This was even taken to the extreme, where mothers threw their own children off of cliff sides to spare being captured by US forces, then jumping off themselves to their deaths. This propaganda effort to radicalize the population against the US ultimately led to the untimely deaths of thousands of innocents, in such a manner that the inhabitants now still haven't forgiven Japan to this day. Operation Bodyguard was the codename for a World War II deception strategy employed by the Allies prior to the 1944 invasion of Normandy Beach. Due to Germany already having intel about a future Allied coastal invasion, the primary goal of the initiative was to make them believe a different coastal target was planned, as well as mask the actual date of the operation to a much further time ahead. This was partly done by using actual inflatable replicas of Allied tanks, planes, vehicles, and even landing craft, which would be indistinguishable from their real counterparts by German recon planes from their distance above. All of these were positioned by the English coastline, particularly near Pas-de-Calais, where the shortest distance across the English Channel to France would be, and arguably a more strategically viable location to invade. This turned out to be a huge success, leading to a surprise attack on Normandy Beach, and delaying the reinforcements Germany needed to adequately repel the invading US force. Behavioral sink, a term invented by John B. Calhoun, describes the collapse in behavior that can result from overcrowding in tight condition. Beginning in 1947, Calhoun started experimenting with rat colonies, placing 32 to 56 rats within a 10 by 14 foot cage in a barn. Labeled as a rat utopia, his string of experiments provided rats with unlimited resources needed for survival. Then a later experiment, known as Universe 25, ultimately resulted in a peak population of 2,200 mice in an even smaller enclosure. Results began to cycle with new iterations of the experiment. Hypersexual behaviors would emerge in the beginning, followed by murderously aggressive homosexual behaviors, and then ultimately, asexual and cannibalistic behaviors that would lead to the extinction of the colony. The experiment set to conclude the importance of personal space within the needs hierarchy of beings, even when all other needs are taken care of, as the neglect of that aspect can lead to deviant, self-destructive behaviors for the colony as a whole. Agitprop, short for agitation propaganda, is the usage of emotional reaction and propaganda in order to mobilize a population against or for a specific entity or idea. This was first characterized by the Bolsheviks prior to the 1917 October Revolution in Russia, using the vigorous promotion of explicit communist ideals in literature, plays, films, flyers, and posters in order to shift public opinion towards what they deemed to be class consciousness. This translated into the modern media sphere, where promoting news or accounts that engage a viewer's emotional reactions above the facts of the story itself has been prioritized more in recent years. Modern politics is something littered with agitprop, as people are almost always guaranteed to vote with their emotions rather than without. The Ju-87 dive bomber, better known as the Stuka, was a ground attack aircraft used by the German Luftwaffe, specializing in the attacks against Allied armor and convoys during World War II. The V-1 rocket was one of the first cruise missiles ever developed, specializing in unguided attacks against Allied cities during the war, which was also developed by Germany, but they both share a similar characteristic. The Stuka was infamous for its Jericho trumpets, which were wind sirens attached to the aircraft that would engage when put into a dive maneuver, resulting in a deafening high-pitched screech heard by bystanders on the ground. And the V-1, nicknamed the Buzz Bomb, would produce a loud rumbling noise as it approached a target. Then it would cut out to complete silence as it dove to its detonation area. During the Blitzkrieg, the Stuka had a significant psychological effect on innocents that witnessed the destruction, often leaving them with memories of that sound that they would never forget. Similarly to the V-1 rockets, as when at its peak, over 100 would be fired upon southeastern England every day relentlessly. Truly a horror to behold. The space race was the not-so-subtle unspoken war between the United States and the USSR to be the first to develop rocket technology capable of reaching above the atmosphere and orbiting the Earth. The USSR was successful in sending the first human being to orbit the Earth in 1961, with JFK then committing to the goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely by the end of the decade. Teams of German scientists operated on both sides of the race following World War II. Werner von Braun, the scientist behind the German V-2 rocket technology, pioneered intercontinental rocket propulsion for the United States, eventually fulfilling the goal set by JFK 8 years prior by landing Apollo 11 on the moon. This time period was arguably the greatest leap in technology seen in the shortest time frame in history. It was all initiated and perpetuated through separate eyes of propaganda seen against two Cold War superpowers. Likely the first time overt psyops led to such human progress occurring. Informants are individuals who provide privileged, secret information about people or groups at the direction of an agency, typically police or federal. The incentive of being an informant or a rat is sometimes a financial reward, seeking redemption, but is most often for the promise of lesser prison time or witness protection if incriminating evidence is gathered. The constant suspicion by gangs, organized crime syndicates, or supposed extremist groups against informants often lean to the side of obsessive, with punishment for such betrayal often leading to death in many cases if discovered. The very thought of betrayal possibly existing within the ranks of an organization has been a useful trick by three-letter agencies to keep these groups overly cautious and ineffective in their respective spheres. The Mandela effect is the phenomenon coined by the internet that revealed a string of contradicting historical memories experienced by different groups of people at once. The name comes from the belief that Nelson Mandela, a South African politician, actually died in prison in the 1980s instead of 2013, which was a consistent belief shared by a non-insignificant amount of people. Theories rose about, considering the notion of parallel realities somehow intersecting at various points and merging the contradictory experiences of various people in question. Researchers often point to collective inconsistent false memories being to blame, where the concept of déjà vu and fragmenting pieces of other memories leads to people believing contradictory accounts of history. But the jury is still out. Active measures are used to describe political warfare conducted by the Soviet Union and current Russian Federation, which includes operations in the range of espionage, propaganda, sabotage, and assassinations based on foreign policy objectives of the respective government. Described as the heart and soul of Soviet intelligence, the overarching purpose of these measures were to subvert the West from the inside and sow discord among the Allied powers and NATO. When the Michoacan archive was revealed, it disclosed the numerous, quote, measures taken against the US public during the Cold War, including claims that the CIA invented the AIDS virus, funding over $1 billion into anti-war NGOs during the Vietnam War, and the KGB's measures taken to stoke racial tension during the Civil Rights Movement. This doesn't even include actions done all over the world in order to challenge NATO, but the same directives and principles that defined active measures for the KGB are still applied in their modern intelligence counterparts. Timothy Leary was a Harvard psychologist and speaker known for his strong advocacy for psychedelic drugs in the 1960s. He notoriously contributed to experiments testing the efficacy of psilocybin on inmates at Concord Prison to test if it reduced the chances of future criminality. He was known to have connections to the CIA, and as he claims, they were supplying psychiatrists all over the country with LSD to, quote, prescribe to willing patients. This was seen as a proxy measure by the CIA to allegedly expand the research that MKUltra began without the paper trail that would inevitably point to their fault. It's been claimed that this is in part responsible for the counterculture movement in the US throughout the 60s, all through the influence of psychedelics bolstered by these two parties. Agenda 21 is a non-binding action plan of the United Nations to supposedly create sustainable development, end global poverty, and promote social justice throughout the world. Adopting the program in 1992, the 21 in the name stands for the 21st century, as well as the global sustainable development rollout they intended to finalize by the year 2000, which obviously came and went. This has caught the eye of many skeptics and theorists out there who believe that the rollout of the 4-section agenda has resulted in uses of inorganic agitprop, manipulation of media, and even manufactured crises in order to implement a worldwide authoritarian regime, better known as the New World Order. An order which, in simple terms, would seek action in mass depopulation, banning all religious practice, implementing a global digital currency, and basically the enslavement of all who remain. This was initially touted as a baseless conspiracy theory. However, measures described within the resolution have outlined the various cultural conflicts faced by the Western world in the past 15 years or so. So, you can be the judge. Enhanced Interrogation was the program initiated by the CIA as a list of advanced torture procedures used to extract information from high-profile detainees. Methods included waterboarding, sleep deprivation, forced stress positions, hooding, subjection to deafening music, walling, assault, extreme heat and cold, and degrees of white torture, to name a few. These measures were implemented after the 9/11 attacks in order to extract key info of a greater motive from possible suspects, moving them to sanctioned black sites all over the world. As the global war on terror raged on, these methods would continue throughout the decade, until threat of investigation by Congress and an executive order in 2009 rescinded advanced methods of interrogation to just the Standard 19. Subliminal messaging is the act of placing words, visuals, or symbols just below an individual's threshold for conscious perception, while still activating regions of the subconscious mind without awareness. This has been a common practice in advertising, where agencies often have specialist consultants who advertise with the most effective methods to sell to a target demographic, with the primary goal being a subconscious call to action in the consumer rather than something too obvious. It's been theorized that subliminal messages exist in much more sinister forms, specifically when talking about the federal government. Some claim that the existence of the Eye of Providence as a prolific symbol of government iconography points to the subconscious assertion that the Freemasons, or Illuminati, are secretly calling the shots. As it is, however, influencing the subconscious mind has been a fascination of corporations and government intrigue for probably as long as they've been around. So make sure you're not letting anything in that you don't want sticking around for a while. Crisis actors are trained actors, role players, or volunteers who portray victims during emergency situations enacted in realistic training scenarios, typically for government or first responder training. This has led to the speculation that the US, or various other powers, often use these actors in events involving terrorist attacks, mass shootings, or various acts of war, all in order to stage victims at the site, conduct interviews, or stage photo ops for the media press. This belief often goes in tandem with the reality of false flag events, or questionably intentioned acts leading up to or following real-life tragedies, typically done by state departments or related agencies. Though it's quite a controversial belief, crisis actors are known to have been used in wartime agitprop for as long as photography existed, typically portraying distraught, vulnerable individuals, such as widows or children, in order to stir sympathy from the general public and call on them to promote a greater intended narrative. And that does it for this first part of the Psyop Iceberg. I hope you at least enjoyed or learned something so far. And as you listen to this, I'm already working on finishing the second part, so be sure to subscribe and get notified for when that drops very soon. But until then, I've been Terrorlore, so stay frosty out there.